Sometimes the worst betrayal leads you to the greatest blessing you never saw coming. Sometimes the man everyone tells you isn't good enough turns out to be worth more than all of them combined. In the frontier town of Clearwater Ridge, Eliza Moreland's wealthy suitor publicly betrayed her, leaving her ruined and alone. With nowhere else to turn, she married Jonah Hawley, a quiet mountain man everyone believed had nothing but a simple cabin and worn clothes. The town pitied her for marrying so far beneath her station. But when two strangers arrived with documents proving Jonah was the wealthiest man for 1,000 miles, everything changed. He'd hidden his fortune to escape a world of greed. Now Eliza must decide if a marriage born from heartbreak can become real love. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow brings something special. Clearwater Ridge, set in a valley where the mountains met the high plains. A town carved from determination and timber. The main street ran straight as a rifle shot, lined with false-fronted buildings that caught the morning sun and threw long shadows in the evening. Dust hung in the air most days, stirred by wagon wheels and the hooves of horses tied to hitching posts. The smell of pine resin drifted down from the surrounding forests, mixing with wood smoke and the yeasty scent of fresh bread from the bakery dot. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, where reputation mattered more than money, and where a person's word was their bond. The territory was still young enough that fortunes could be made or lost on a handshake, and old enough that society had begun to stratify into invisible but inflexible layers. Eliza Moreland had lived in Clearwater Ridge for 8 years, ever since her father died and left her with nothing but debts and the worn books from his schoolroom. She'd been 18 then, alone in a world that didn't offer many options for young women without family or fortune. She'd found work at Adelaide Crane's General Store, a position that paid enough for a room at the boarding house and kept her fed. If not comfortable. At 26, Eliza had settled into a life of quiet dignity. She kept the store's accounts with meticulous care, helped customers with genuine warmth, and attended church every Sunday in one of her 3 rotating dresses, each mended so carefully the repairs were nearly invisible. Her father had been educated back east, and he'd passed that education to her. She could quote poetry, discuss philosophy, and cipher numbers faster than most men in town. But education didn't pay bills or secure futures, especially not for women. She wore her dark blonde hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, and her eyes a warm hazel that shifted between green and brown, depending on the light held an intelligence that some men found threatening and others found intriguing. She was pretty in an understated way, with high cheekbones and a mouth that smiled easily, though there was often a hint of sadness beneath that smile, a recognition that life had not unfolded as her father had once promised it would. Adelaide Crane, the store's owner, had become something of a surrogate mother to Eliza, a widow in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and capable hands. Adelaide ran her business with fairness and her life with practicality. She'd taken a chance on a grieving 18-year-old girl, and she'd never regretted it. The two women worked together with the easy rhythm of long partnership, anticipating each other's needs, sharing quiet conversations during slow afternoons. "You deserve more than this," Adelaide would say sometimes, gesturing at the store with flour-dusted hands. "You deserve a home of your own children, a man who appreciates what you are." Eliza would smile and change the subject. She'd long ago stopped imagining such things. In a town like Clearwater Ridge, opportunities for women her age were limited. Most men married younger girls, and those who didn't were usually widowers looking for mothers for existing children rather than partners for genuine companionship. Then Theodore Blackwell arrived. He came to Clearwater Ridge in the autumn, 6 months before everything fell apart. His father was a railroad investor from Denver, and Theodore had been sent to survey the territory for potential expansion. He was 32, handsome in a polished way that seemed exotic in the rough-hewn town. He wore tailored suits that must have cost more than Eliza earned in a year. And he spoke with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. He came into the store on his third day in town, looking for decent tobacco. Eliza helped him, and he lingered, asking questions about the town, the territory, the people. His attention felt like sunlight after a long winter. He returned the next day, and the day after that, always finding reasons to stop by, always directing his conversation to Eliza rather than Adelaide. Within 2 weeks, he'd asked permission to escort her to church. Within a month, he was calling every Sunday afternoon, sitting in the boarding house parlor while the landlady chaperoned from a discreet distance. Within 3 months, everyone in town assumed they'd be engaged by spring. Theodore spoke of the future with casual certainty. When the railroad comes through, he'd say, this town will transform. The right people, positioned properly, will prosper. He'd look at Eliza meaningfully when he said it, and she'd allow herself to imagine being one of those right people, finally secure, finally certain of her place. He brought her small gifts, a hair ribbon from Denver, a book of poetry, a cameo brooch that had belonged to his grandmother. She wore the brooch to church, and the other women noticed, their glances confirming what Eliza barely dared to believe, that she was being courted seriously, that her years of patient waiting might finally yield the stability she craved. Reverend Samuel Porter, who'd known Eliza since she'd arrived in town, offered gentle counsel. Theodore seemed sincere, he said, but test the depth of a man's character before you tie your life to his. Surface charm is easy. Genuine integrity is rare. Eliza had nodded, but she'd been too hopeful to heed the warning. Theodore was attentive, complimentary, seemingly devoted. He spoke of values and principles. He treated her with respect in public. What more could she ask for? There were moments, brief, easily dismissed, when doubt flickered. The way Theodore's eyes would appraise other women when he thought Eliza wasn't watching. The casual condescension in his voice when he spoke of simple people in town. The way he'd steer conversations toward money and status more often than toward ideas or feelings. But Eliza had pushed these observations aside. No one was perfect. She certainly wasn't. Perhaps she was being too critical, too cautious. Adelaide had been less easy to convince. I don't trust a man who needs to remind everyone how important he is, she'd said once, quiet enough that only Eliza could hear. Truly important men don't need to advertise it. But by then, Eliza was too invested in the dream to let wisdom interfere. For the first time in 8 years, she'd allowed herself to imagine a different life. A real home, not just a boarding house room. Children, perhaps. A partner to share the weight of existence. Security that didn't depend on a single employer's continued goodwill. She should have paid more attention to the man who came to town once a month, driving a wagon loaded with furs and wild game. Jonah Holly lived somewhere up in the mountains, in a cabin no one from town had ever visited. He was perhaps 35, tall and lean, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. He dressed in warm buckskin and homespun, spoke rarely, and conducted his business with quiet efficiency. He'd been coming to Clearwater Ridge for 5 years, always selling to the same buyers, always purchasing the same supplies: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, tobacco. He was unfailingly polite, paid in cash, and left without lingering. Some people found him unsettling. Others simply forgot about him the moment he disappeared back into the mountains. Eliza had noticed him, though. It was hard not to notice a man who moved with such contained purpose, who seemed so comfortable in silence. He'd nod to her when he came into the store, and she'd nod back. Their interactions limited to good morning and thank you, ma'am. But she'd caught him watching her sometimes, his expression unreadable, and she'd felt an odd flutter of awareness before dismissing it as foolishness. He'd been in the store the day Theodore brought the cameo brooch. And she'd seen something shift in Jonah's eyes as Theodore clasped it around her neck with proprietary satisfaction. But Jonah had said nothing, just paid for his supplies and left. And Eliza had forgotten about it in the warmth of Theodore's attention. She should have paid attention. Should have noticed the quality of Jonah's silence, the intelligence in his eyes, the way he treated everyone with the same quiet respect regardless of their station. Should have recognized that genuine character often wore humble clothes, while false character dressed itself in expensive fabric. But she'd been 26 and tired of struggle, and Theodore had promised her everything she thought she wanted. So she'd smiled at his compliments, accepted his gifts, and planned for a future that existed only in imagination. Spring came early that year, melting the snow by March, bringing wildflowers to the meadows and hope to Eliza's carefully guarded heart. The town planned a social for April, a celebration of the season's renewal. Theodore had hinted that he might have something special to announce. Eliza had allowed herself to believe she knew what that announcement would be. She'd been so very, very wrong. The spring social was held in the town hall, a building that served triple duty as meeting place, dance floor, and occasional courtroom. Someone had strung paper lanterns from the rafters, and the ladies had brought their best dishes to cover 2 long tables. The fiddle player was tuning his instrument in the corner, and laughter already filled the space with warmth that pushed back against the cool evening air outside. Eliza had spent more than she should have on fabric for a new dress. It was a soft blue that Adelaide said brought out the green in her eyes, with a modest neckline and carefully pressed skirt. She'd styled her hair with extra care, pinning it in a softer arrangement that framed her face. She wore Theodore's grandmother's cameo at her throat, the weight of it a promise she'd allowed herself to believe in. She arrived with Adelaide, who'd closed the store early so they could help with preparations. The older woman had been unusually quiet during the walk, and Eliza had attributed it to fatigue. She'd been too caught up in her own anticipation to notice the worry lines around Adelaide's mouth, the way her employer kept glancing at her with something that looked almost like grief. Theodore arrived fashionably late, as was his habit. Eliza heard the murmur that announced his entrance before she saw him, and she turned with a smile already forming, ready to greet the man she expected would be her future husband. The smile froze on her face. Theodore wasn't alone. On his arm was a woman Eliza had never seen before, stunning in a way that made Eliza's careful new dress feel suddenly shabby. She wore emerald silk that must have come from San Francisco or even further, with a neckline that pushed the boundaries of propriety and a confidence that announced she didn't care. Her hair was dark and elaborately styled, her skin pale and perfect, her jewelry catching the lantern light with expensive sparkle. Theodore's smile was broad and utterly unconcerned as he surveyed the room. When his eyes found Eliza's, there was no guilt in them, no apology, just a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction before he looked away. Reverend Porter stepped forward, his usual social duty to welcome newcomers. But Theodore spoke first, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "Friends," he said, and the word felt like mockery. "I'm delighted to introduce Miss Carolyn Ashford of San Francisco, daughter of James Ashford, whose railroad investments many of you may have heard of." He paused, letting the weight of that name settle. James Ashford was one of the wealthiest men in the West, and as of this morning, my fiancé. The silence that followed was absolute. Eliza felt it like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs, turning her legs to water. The room tilted slightly, and she reached for the table beside her, gripping the edge hard enough that her knuckles went white. Theodore continued, seemingly oblivious to the shock rippling through the crowd. "We'll be married in San Francisco this summer. Caroline has graciously agreed to join me here for a brief visit so she might see the territory that will make our fortune." He turned to Eliza then, and his expression was perfectly calibrated, apologetic but firm. as if he were delivering unfortunate but necessary news. "Miss Moreland, I must apologize for any misunderstanding that may have arisen from my attentions these past months. I hope you'll understand that business considerations sometimes require difficult decisions." Any misunderstanding. As if their 6 months of courtship, his gifts, his promises, his talk of their future together had been nothing more than a misinterpretation on her part. As if she'd invented the whole relationship from thin air. Eliza couldn't speak, couldn't move. The cameo at her throat felt like it was choking her. Callan Ashford smiled, an expression that held pity and something sharper, something almost like triumph. "I do hope we might still be friends, Miss Moreland," she said, her voice honey-sweet and utterly false. "Theodore has told me so much about your kindness in showing him around this quaint little town." Quaint, kindness. The words were designed to wound, to reduce Eliza's relationship with Theodore to that of a helpful local guide rather than a courted woman. And from the satisfied glint in Caroline's eyes, she knew exactly what she was doing. The room erupted in whispers. Eliza felt them like insects crawling across her skin. She saw Adelaide moving toward her, saw Reverend Porter's face tight with disapproval, saw Mrs. Henderson from the ranch covering her mouth in shock. But she also saw other faces, Mrs. Garrett, the boarding house landlady, looking at her with calculation, Mr. Thompson, the bank manager, averting his eyes. Young Sarah Mills, barely 16, smirking behind her hand as if Eliza's humiliation was entertaining. She had to leave. Had to get out before she broke completely, before she gave them all the satisfaction of watching her cry. She released her grip on the table, willing her legs to hold her, and turned toward the door. "Eliza, wait!" Adelaide called. But Eliza couldn't stop. If she stopped, she'd shatter. She made it outside before the first sob escaped. The cool evening air hit her face, and she gulped it down, trying to breathe through the pain that felt like it was splitting her chest open. She'd been a fool. Worse than a fool. She'd believed him. She'd trusted him. She'd let herself hope. Behind her, the murmur of voices grew louder as people processed what had just happened. She heard Theodore's laugh, easy and unconcerned. Heard someone say, "Poor thing," she really thought, before another voice hushed them. Eliza walked, then ran, her vision blurred with tears she could no longer hold back. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from the lights and the voices and the crushing weight of her own stupidity. She found herself behind the livery stable. In the shadows where no one would see her fall apart, she leaned against the rough wood wall and let the sobs come, great heaving gasps that shook her entire body. The cameo dug into her palm where she'd ripped it from her throat, and she looked down at it with something close to hatred. His grandmother's brooch. Another lie. He'd probably bought it at some shop in Denver and invented the story to make it seem more meaningful. Miss Moreland. The voice was quiet, respectful, and came from several feet away. Eliza's head snapped up, and through her tears she saw Jonah Hawley standing at the edge of the shadows. He must have been checking on his horse when she ran past. He held his hat in his hands, and his expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes held something she couldn't quite name. Sympathy, perhaps? Or understanding. "I apologize for intruding," he said. "I'll leave you to your privacy." "Wait," Eliza said, the word escaping before she could stop it. She didn't know why she'd called out to him, didn't know what she expected from this quiet man who barely spoke to anyone. But something in his stillness felt like safety, and she desperately needed to feel safe. He waited, not moving closer, giving her the choice. "Did you?" Her voice cracked. "Did you see what happened in there?" "I was leaving as Mr. Blackwell made his announcement," Jonah said. "I saw enough." The understatement somehow made it easier to bear. No excessive sympathy, no false reassurances. Just acknowledgement of the fact. "I've been such a fool," Eliza whispered. "No, ma'am," Jonah said, and his voice was firm. "Being trusting isn't foolish. Being unworthy of trust is. The fault lies with him, not you. Something about the certainty in his words cut through her spiral of self-recrimination. She looked at him properly for the first time. This mountain man she'd barely noticed over the years. In the dim light, his face was all strong angles and shadows, but his eyes were kind. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that." He nodded once. "Do you need help getting back to your lodgings?" "No, She stopped. Did she want to go back to the boarding house? To face Mrs. Garrett's calculating eyes, to hear the whispers through thin walls, to lie awake knowing that everyone was talking about her humiliation? "I should go," she said finally, because there was nowhere else to go. Jonah replaced his hat and nodded again. "Ma'am," he said, a simple farewell, and turned to leave. He was 3 steps away when he stopped and turned back. "Miss Moreland," he said, and something in his tone made her look up. "What that man did tonight says everything about his character and nothing about yours. Don't let him steal who you are along with everything else he's taken." Then he walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the stable, leaving Eliza alone with her tears and a small, unexpected ember of warmth in the frozen wasteland of her heart. The next 3 days were the worst of Eliza's life. The morning after the social, Mrs. Garrett knocked on her door before breakfast. "I've been thinking," the landlady said, her voice falsely apologetic, "and given recent events, I believe it would be best if you found other accommodations. I have a reputation to consider, and having a woman of questionable judgment residing here, well, it simply won't do." Questionable judgment. As if being betrayed was a character flaw. At the store, Adelaide was fiercely protective, but even her loyalty couldn't shield Eliza from the changed atmosphere. Customers who'd been friendly for years now looked through her or offered pitying smiles that felt worse than hostility. Mrs. Thompson mentioned loudly to her companion that some girls simply don't understand their place while standing 5 feet from where Eliza was stocking shelves. Young Sarah Mills came in with her mother and whispered behind her hand, dissolving into giggles when Eliza looked their way. Theodore and Caroline appeared periodically, Caroline's arm possessively through Theodore's as they paraded through town. Once they came into the store, and Eliza had to help Caroline select fabric while the other woman made casual comments about wedding plans and San Francisco society. Each word a tiny knife, designed to remind Eliza of everything she'd never have. The invitations stopped. The polite nods on the street became averted eyes. The carefully maintained position she'd built over 8 years crumbled in 72 hours. On the 3rd day, Adelaide closed the store early and sat Eliza down in the back room. "I need to tell you something," she said, and the grief in her voice made Eliza's stomach clench. "Mr. Thompson came by this morning. He's concerned that the store's reputation is being damaged by recent associations. He suggested that perhaps a change in staffing might be advisable. He wants you to dismiss me," Eliza said flatly. "I told him to go to hell," Adelaide said fiercely. "This is my store, and I'll employ who I damn well please." "But Eliza," her voice softened, "I can protect you here, but I can't protect you from the whole town. And without lodgings, without prospects." "I know," Eliza said. The numbness that had settled over her made it easier to face the truth. She had no family, no home, no future in Clearwater Ridge. Theodore hadn't just broken her heart. He'd destroyed her life. That evening, as she sat in her boarding house room packing her few possessions into a carpet bag, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Jonah Hollis standing in the hallway, hat in hands, looking distinctly uncomfortable but absolutely determined. "Miss Moreland," he said, "I'd like to speak with you, if you are willing." 2 months into their marriage, summer settled over the mountains with a warmth that made the high country bloom. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the days stretched long and golden. Eliza found herself falling into the rhythms of mountain life more easily than she'd imagined possible. She'd grown stronger, her hands roughening from work, but her body feeling more vital than it had in years of indoor labor. She could split kindling now, tend the garden without exhausting herself, even handle the horses with growing confidence. The mountain air suited her, and the isolation that had initially frightened her began to feel like freedom. But her curiosity about Jonah grew with each passing. They thought he was careful about certain things, particular about which supplies he bought on his monthly trips to town, protective of a locked wooden chest beneath the bed in the loft. Sometimes distracted in ways that suggested his mind traveled to places he didn't speak of. Once, she'd woken in the night to hear him talking in his sleep. Words she couldn't quite make out, but that sounded like grief. One afternoon, while Jonah was checking his trapline, Eliza was cleaning the cabin more thoroughly than usual. She developed a routine for these deeper cleanings, moving furniture, sweeping beneath, dusting places that didn't see regular attention. She pulled books from the shelf to dust behind them, and the leather-bound journal fell to the floor, landing open. She shouldn't have looked. She knew that, but her eyes caught on a page before she could stop herself, and what she saw made no sense. The journal wasn't a diary. It was filled with calculations, complex geological surveys, mineral assessments, financial projections. There were maps with topographical details she didn't understand, lists of names and companies, profit margins that made her eyes widen. These weren't the notes of a trapper. These were sophisticated business documents, the kind Theodore used to carry when discussing railroad investments. Eliza closed the journal quickly, her heart pounding. She slipped it back onto the shelf, but her mind raced with questions. Who was Jonah Hawley? What was he doing with mining surveys and financial calculations? Why would a mountain hermit need this kind of information? For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Eliza felt uneasy. She'd trusted him, had been forced to trust him. But what if she'd been wrong? What if there was danger here she hadn't recognized? That evening at dinner, she watched him more carefully. He ate with his usual quiet efficiency, asked about her day, mentioned he'd seen elk tracks to the north. Normal conversation, normal behavior. Nothing threatening. And yet, Jonah, she said, setting down her fork, what did you do before you came to live here? He looked up, something guarded flickering across his face. Various things. Why do you ask? I'm curious about you, Eliza said, which was true, if incomplete. We've been married 2 months, and I know almost nothing of your past. Jonah was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Some things are better left in the past, he said finally. They don't matter to who I am now, don't they? Eliza pressed, surprising herself with her boldness. You're educated. Your books aren't those of a simple trapper. You speak like someone who had advantages, opportunities. Yet you live alone on a mountain, avoiding people? Why? Maybe I just prefer solitude, Jonah said, his tone cooling. I don't believe that, Eliza said. You're lonely. I see it in your eyes sometimes. Whatever drove you here, it wasn't preference. It was escape. Jonah's jaw tightened. He stood abruptly, taking his plate to the wash basin. I've given you safety and respect, Eliza. That should be enough. My past is my own business. I'm your wife, Eliza said, standing as well. Don't I deserve to know who you really are? He turned to face her, and she saw genuine conflict in his expression, the desire to tell her warring with whatever kept him silent. No, he said finally. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some truths change everything, and I'm not ready to risk that. Risk what? Eliza demanded. This, Jonah said, gesturing between them. Whatever this is becoming. The peace we found here. Your trust. His voice softened slightly. I've given you as much honesty as I can. Please don't ask for more. Eliza wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers to the questions piling up in her mind. But something in his eyes stopped her real fear, barely concealed. Whatever he was hiding, it mattered deeply, and pushing him might shatter the fragile bond they'd built. "All right," she said quietly, "but Jonah's secrets have a way of revealing themselves. And when they do, they hurt worse if they come from hiding than if they come from honesty." "I know," he said. "Believe me, I know." The warmth between them cooled after that conversation. They remained polite, continued their chess games, maintained their routines. But distance had crept back in, a reminder that they were still strangers bound by circumstance rather than true understanding. A week later, their nearest neighbors visited, the Henderson family, from a ranch about an hour's ride to the east. Eliza had heard Jonah mention them but never met them. They arrived in a wagon with 3 children ranging from 6 to 12, all freckled and energetic. Martha Henderson was a capable woman in her 40s, with weathered hands and kind eyes. Her husband, Robert, was gruff but friendly. They brought gifts: fresh eggs, butter, a loaf of bread, and obvious curiosity about Jonah's new wife. "We heard about your marriage," Martha said to Eliza while the men talked outside and the children explored the clearing. "Wanted to meet the woman who finally convinced this one to take a wife." There was something in her tone that made Eliza look up sharply. "You know Jonah well?" "As well as he lets anyone know him," Martha said. "He's helped us more than once over the years. Good man. Very good man, though he tries to hide it." She paused, studying Eliza. "You're fortunate, Mrs. Holly. Not many women get the chance to marry a man of such." She seemed to search for the right word. "Such substance." Substance. Another curious word choice. Another hint at depths Eliza couldn't fathom. "He's been kind to me," Eliza said carefully. "Kinder than I had any right to expect." "He would be," Martha said. "Kindness runs deep in some men. Usually the ones who've known cruelty." Her eyes held knowledge she clearly wouldn't share. "Whatever brought you to this marriage, Mrs. Holly, I hope you'll give it and him a real chance. He deserves happiness. God knows he's earned it." The words stayed with Eliza long after the Hendersons left, their children waving enthusiastically from the wagon. She watched Jonah wave back, saw the way his expression softened when he looked at the family, and wondered what losses had made solitude seem preferable to such simple joy. That night, unable to sleep, Eliza did something she knew was wrong. She waited until she heard Jonah's breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep, then crept to the loft ladder. She climbed carefully, quietly, until she could see the space where he slept. The locked chest was there, beneath his narrow bed. She'd never been curious enough to violate his privacy before, but Martha Henderson's words had awakened something, not just curiosity, but concern. What was he hiding that required such secrecy? She didn't touch the chest. Couldn't bring herself to that level of betrayal. But she saw other things in the dim moonlight filtering through the loft window. Clothes hanging from pegs that were far finer than anything Jonah wore daily. A pocket watch on the small table beside his bed, silver and clearly expensive. And books, a stack of them, different from those downstairs. Business ledgers, legal documents, correspondence with official-looking seals. Her heart hammered. Whatever Jonah was hiding, it wasn't just personal history. It was identity itself. She climbed back down as quietly as she'd ascended and returned to her room. But sleep eluded her entirely. She lay awake, questions spinning through her mind. Who had Jonah been before he became a mountain hermit? What had driven him to abandon a life that clearly included wealth and education? And most troubling of all, could she trust a man who'd built their entire relationship on incomplete truth? By morning, she'd made a decision. She wouldn't confront him again, wouldn't push for answers he wasn't ready to give. But she would watch, would pay attention, would piece together the puzzle of Jonah Holly from the clues he unknowingly left behind. She owed him that much. The patience he'd shown her, returned in kind. But she also owed herself protection. Theodore had taught her the danger of blind trust. She wouldn't make that mistake again, even with a man who'd shown her nothing but kindness. The truth, whatever it was, would eventually reveal itself. And when it did, Eliza would be ready to decide whether the man she'd married was someone she could truly trust, or just another beautiful lie wearing a different face. The tension between them grew subtle but undeniable. Eliza continued her household duties. Jonah continued his work, but the easy companionship that had been developing fractured into careful politeness. Their chess games became less frequent, their conversations more guarded. Then, 3 days after her midnight discovery, Eliza found the pocket watch. She'd been gathering Jonah's clothes for washing when it fell from the pocket of the trousers he'd worn the day before. It hit the floor with a solid thunk, and she bent to retrieve it automatically. The silver case was cool in her palm, beautifully engraved with a pattern of leaves and vines. But it was the initials on the back that made her freeze. JMH, not JH3 initials. And unless Jonah had a middle name he'd never mentioned, these weren't his initials at all. Or rather, they were more than the name he'd given her. Her hands trembled as she opened the case. Inside was a watch face of remarkable quality, and opposite it, a small photograph. A family portrait. A distinguished older man, an elegant woman, and 2 young men who might have been brothers. One of them was unmistakably a younger Jonah, perhaps 20 years old, dressed in expensive clothes and standing in what looked like a formal parlor. This wasn't the photograph of a trapper's family. This was wealth. This was society. This was everything Jonah had supposedly left behind. Eliza closed the watch carefully and set it on the table. She sat down, her mind racing. The mining documents, the fine clothes, the expensive books, the way the Hendersons treated him with deferential respect. And now this proof that Jonah's identity was far more complex than he'd led her to believe. She felt betrayed, though she knew the feeling wasn't entirely fair. He'd never lied to her, not directly. He'd just withheld truths. But wasn't that the same thing? Hadn't Theodore done the same, creating a false picture through omission? When Jonah returned that evening, he found her sitting at the table, the watch between them like an accusation. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes going immediately to the silver case. Something flickered across his face, resignation, perhaps, or relief that the secret was finally exposed. "You want to know?" he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I deserve to know," Eliza replied, keeping her voice level despite the emotion churning inside her. "I married you, Jonah. I live here, in isolation, trusting you completely. Yes, I want to know who you really are." Jonah removed his hat slowly, hung it on its peg. He crossed to the table but didn't sit, just stood there looking down at the watch with an expression that held old grief. "Jonah Marcus Hawley," he said finally. "That's my full name. My father was Marcus Hall Sr. My mother was Elizabeth." He picked up the watch, opened it, looked at the photograph with eyes that had seen too much loss. "This was taken 12 years ago, when I was 23. The other young man is my brother, Thomas. He was 20. Was?" Eliza asked softly. "He died 5 years ago," Jonah said. "That's when I came here. When I left everything behind." The pain in his voice was raw enough that Eliza's anger softened slightly. "What happened?" Jonah closed the watch, but didn't put it away. Just held it in his palm like a talisman against memory. "My father made a fortune in silver mining. Not through labor, but through investment and geological knowledge. By the time I was born, we were one of the wealthiest families in the territory. We had everything money could buy: education, opportunities, status." He paused, and Eliza waited, sensing that pushing would only close him off again. "Thomas and I were raised to take over the family business," Jonah continued. "He was the charming one, the one people loved. I was the serious one, the one who understood the actual work. We complemented each other well. Or we did until," his voice caught, Until Thomas fell in love. With the wrong person? Eliza guessed. With a lie, Jonah corrected bitterly. A woman who seemed perfect. Beautiful, educated, from a good family. Or so she claimed. What she actually was part of a conspiracy. Her family had debts, connections to men who wanted access to our mining operations. They saw Thomas as their route to fortune. Eliza's breath caught. The parallels to her own story with Theodore were painful. Thomas was naive, Jonah said. He believed in goodness and love. He got engaged to her despite my concerns. I investigated, found proof of the scheme. When I told him, he confronted her family. Jonah's hands tightened on the watch until his knuckles went white. They panicked. There was an argument. Someone drew a gun. Thomas died in my arms, bleeding out from a wound that should never have existed. Oh, Jonah, Eliza whispered. The law came down on them eventually. Jonah continued, his voice hollow. But it didn't bring Thomas back. And my mother, she couldn't survive the loss. She died 6 months later. Heart failure, the doctor said, but I knew better. She died of grief. He finally looked at Eliza, and she saw devastation in his eyes, barely contained even after 5 years. My father never recovered either, Jonah said. He threw himself into work, built the business bigger, but the joy was gone. I tried to help, tried to step into Thomas's place, but I couldn't. Every social event, every business dealing, every interaction reminded me of what we'd lost, of how money had poisoned everything. So you left, Eliza said. I ran, Jonah corrected. I took what money I needed to buy this land and build this cabin, and I disappeared. Told my father I couldn't live that life anymore. Couldn't trust anyone. Couldn't bear the weight of wealth. Couldn't. He stopped, shook his head. He understood. Or he said he did. He died 6 months ago. Heart attack. I got word from his attorney. The pieces clicked into place for Eliza. The monthly trips to town, she said. You're not just selling furs. You're meeting with attorneys, managing your inheritance. I tried to refuse it, Jonah said, but my father's will was ironclad. Everything came to me. The mining operations, the investments, all of it. So I manage it remotely, through intermediaries. I funnel most of the profits into investments that benefit people, loans to failing ranches, support for widows, infrastructure improvements. I take what I need to live simply, and the rest goes to causes that matter. You're wealthy, Eliza said, the realization settling over her like cold water. On paper, Jonah agreed. But wealth nearly destroyed my family. I won't let it define me. Why didn't you tell me? Eliza asked. Before we married? Jonah met her eyes, and in them she saw vulnerability and fear. Because I've watched what money does to people. How it changes them, corrupts them, makes them see you as a resource rather than a person. He stopped, seemed to gather courage. I needed to know you'd stay for the right reasons. That you'd see me, not my fortune. He gestured at the cabin, at their simple life. That this would be enough. You tested me, Eliza said, anger flickering again. No, Jonah said firmly. I protected myself. And maybe I protected you too. You'd just been destroyed by a man who valued status over substance. I didn't want to be another version of that, just with different wrapping. Eliza stood, needing to move, needing space to process. She walked to the window, looked out at the mountains darkening in twilight. I understand why you hid it, she said finally. I even understand why you couldn't tell me before. But Jonah marriages can't survive on secrets. Trust requires honesty, even when it's hard. I know, he said quietly. I'm sorry. I should have told you weeks ago, but I was afraid. Of what? Of losing you? He said simply. Of watching you look at me differently. Of this thing between us, This friendship we've built crumbling under the weight of truth. Eliza turned to face him. What thing between us? She asked. We're married out of convenience. You said yourself you didn't expect anything more. Jonah set the watch down carefully. I lied about that too, he said. Not intentionally, but I lied nonetheless. I do want more, Eliza. I want everything. I'm falling in love with you. And I have been since the day I saw Theodore humiliate you and watched you stand there with such dignity despite your pain. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Eliza's heart hammered, emotions warring inside her anger at his deception, gratitude for his honesty, and underneath it all, something that felt dangerously like reciprocation. 3 weeks passed in careful negotiation of new boundaries. Jonah's confession had changed everything and nothing. They were more honest with each other now, but honesty brought its own complications. He loved her. She didn't know how she felt about him, about any of it. So they existed in a strange space between friendship and something deeper, neither willing to push for resolution. Then came the August heat and news of the town's summer celebration. Jonah mentioned it casually over breakfast, watching her reaction carefully. There's a gathering in Clearwater Ridge next week, he said. Social, dancing, the usual festivities. We could attend if you'd like. Or not, whatever you prefer. Eliza's first instinct was refusal. The thought of facing those people again, of seeing Theodore and Carolyn, made her stomach clench. But something else stirred beneath the fear. Defiance, perhaps. Pride. She'd left town humiliated and defeated. Maybe it was time to show them she'd survived. I'll go, she said, if you're willing to escort me. Something shifted in Jonah's expression. Approval, maybe, or satisfaction. I'd be honored, he said. The day of the celebration arrived hot and bright. Eliza wore her best dress, mended but clean, and tried not to think about how shabby she'd look compared to Caroline's undoubtedly expensive wardrobe. Jonah dressed in his usual simple clothes, though she noticed they were newer than most, less worn. The ride to town felt longer than usual, tension building with each mile. When they finally arrived, Eliza's hands were trembling. Jonah noticed and covered one of them briefly with his own. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. We can turn back. No, Eliza said. I need to face them. Need to show them. She stopped. Show them what? That she was fine? That she didn't care? Both would be lies, but necessary ones. The town square was decorated with bunting and lanterns. Tables groaned under the weight of food. Musicians tuned their instruments on a makeshift stage. People clustered in familiar groups, talking and laughing. The scene was achingly normal, as if Eliza's world hadn't ended here 3 months ago. Heads turned as they entered. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Eliza felt every eye on her, judging, assessing, speculating. She lifted her chin and kept walking. Jonah, a solid presence at her side. Adelaide found them first, her face lighting with relief and joy. She embraced Eliza fiercely, then turned to Jonah with approval. You're taking good care of her, she said. It wasn't a question. Trying to, Jonah replied. They found a relatively quiet corner, accepted plates of food they didn't want, and tried to blend into the celebration. But blending was impossible. Too many people were curious about the woman who'd married the mountain hermit, about how their unlikely union was working out. Martha Henderson appeared with her family in tow and greeted them with genuine warmth. Reverend Porter stopped by to offer kind words. A few others approached tentatively, testing whether Eliza was still receptive to social contact. Then Theodore and Caroline arrived. They made an entrance. As always, Caroline wore emerald silk that probably cost more than Eliza earned in a year. Theodore was polished and confident, his arm possessively through Caroline's as they surveyed the gathering like royalty inspecting subjects. Their eyes found Eliza almost immediately. Carolyn whispered something to Theodore, and they both smiled not kindly. They began moving through the crowd, and Eliza realized with growing dread that they were heading directly toward her and Jonah. "Mrs. Halle," Theodore said, his voice carrying false warmth. "How unexpected to see you here. I'd heard you'd settled into mountain life quite contentedly." The implication was clear, that she'd retreated from civilization into primitive isolation because she had no other options. "Mr. Blackwell," Eliza said, keeping her voice level. "Miss Ashford, how lovely to see you both." Caroline's smile was all teeth. "And this must be your husband," she said, looking Jonah up and down with barely concealed disdain. "The famous mountain man. We've heard so much about your simple lifestyle." Simple. The word dripped with condescension. Eliza felt Jonah tense beside her, but his expression remained calm. "Simple has its virtues," he said quietly. "Complications often bring more trouble than they're worth." Theodore laughed, the sound harsh. Spoken like a man who's never had the opportunity for anything more complex. "Tell me, Halle, how does one support a wife on trapping and hunting? Or is Eliza contributing to the household income now? Perhaps taking and washing?" The insult was deliberate, designed to humiliate. Eliza's cheeks burned, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Jonah's hand found hers and squeezed gently, a signal to wait. "We manage," Jonah said. "Happiness doesn't require extravagance." "How charmingly naive," Carolyn said. "Though I suppose it's easier to claim money doesn't matter when one has never had it." She turned to Theodore with exaggerated concern. "Darling, perhaps we should." She stopped mid-sentence, her gaze fixed on something beyond them. Eliza turned to see two men in black coats approaching through the crowd. They moved with purpose, and something about them radiated authority. The celebration's ambient noise began to die as people noticed them. One was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair and a star on his vest. Marshal Davies. Eliza recognized him. The other was younger, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the formal attire of a lawyer or businessman. They walked directly to Jonah. "Jonah Marcus Halle?" the older man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Marshal Davies," Jonah acknowledged. His voice was resigned, as if he'd been expecting this. "Mr. Whitmore." The crowd had gone completely silent now, everyone strained to hear. "We apologize for the public nature of this meeting," the lawyer, Whitmore said. "But we've been trying to locate you for 3 weeks. Your attorney in Denver sent us when you failed to respond to his letters." Jonah sighed. "I've been avoiding correspondence." "What's happened?" Whitmore opened his satchel and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "Your father's estate has completed probate. As his sole surviving heir, you need to sign these documents acknowledging receipt and accepting full control of the assets." The words hung in the air like smoke before an explosion. Eliza felt the world tilt slightly. Estate, heir, assets. These weren't words that belonged in the same sentence as mountain hermit. "I thought we'd handled this quietly," Jonah said. His jaw tight. "So did we," Whitmore replied. "But territorial law requires public acknowledgement of estates over a certain value. Mr. Halle," he paused, seemed to brace himself. "Jonah Marcus Halle, as the sole heir to Halle Silver Enterprises and all associated holdings, you are now the legal owner of the largest private silver mining operation in the territory." Someone gasped. Eliza couldn't tell who. Her own breath had frozen in her lungs. Whitmore continued, his voice carrying across the silent square. "The most recent valuation places your personal wealth at approximately $43 million, making you the wealthiest individual for over 1,000 miles in any direction." The silence that followed was absolute. Then it shattered into chaos whispers, exclamations, disbelief. Eliza stood rooted in place, unable to process what she'd just heard. $43 million. The wealthiest man for 1,000 miles. Jonah. Her Jonah, who wore warm buckskin and lived in a cabin and carved chess pieces by firelight. She turned to look at him and found him watching her with an expression of terrible vulnerability. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Just for her. I wanted to tell you. I tried to tell you." Eliza couldn't finish the sentence. Her mind refused to accept the reality. "He's richer than God," someone in the crowd said, awe and envy mixing in equal measure. Eliza's eyes found Theodore's face. He'd gone pale, then red, then pale again. The realization of what he'd done, of whom he dismissed as a nobody, was written across his features in stark horror. Caroline looked equally stunned, her smug superiority crumbling into something closer to panic. "You knew," Caroline hissed at Theodore. "You had to have known." "I didn't," Theodore said, and his voice shook. "I swear, I didn't." But no one was paying attention to them anymore. All eyes were on Jonah, reassessing, recalculating. The simple mountain man was actually the most powerful person in the entire region. Every interaction, every dismissal, every condescending word suddenly reframed in a new and humiliating light. Marshal Davies cleared his throat. "Mr. Holly, we need your signature on these documents. Your attorney has been managing operations remotely, as per your instructions, but there are decisions requiring your direct authorization." Jonah took the papers, his movements mechanical. "I'll review them tonight and return them tomorrow." "The attorney recommended immediate," Whitmore began. "Tomorrow," Jonah repeated, his voice firm despite the chaos. He turned to Eliza, and she saw desperation in his eyes. "Can we go? Please?" Eliza nodded mutely. She couldn't speak, couldn't think. The man she'd married, the man she'd been learning to trust, maybe even learning to love, was someone entirely different than she'd believed. Not just wealthy, but incomprehensibly wealthy. The kind of wealth that changed everything. They walked toward their wagon through a crowd that parted like water. Everyone staring, whispering, reassessing. Eliza felt Adelaide's concerned gaze, saw Reverend Porter's sympathetic expression, caught Martha Henderson's knowing look that seemed to say, "I tried to tell you." But mostly she felt Theodore's stare burning into her back rage and humiliation and dawning understanding of the catastrophic mistake he'd made. He'd chosen a railroad investor's daughter over the woman who would marry one of the richest men in the West. He'd thrown Eliza away like refuse, and she'd landed in a fortune he couldn't even imagine. The irony would have been satisfying. If Eliza could feel anything at all besides numb shock. Jonah helped her into the wagon, his hands gentle despite his own obvious distress. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, but before he could signal the horses to move, Theodore appeared at the side of the wagon. "Wait," Theodore said, his voice strained. "Eliza, I need to speak with you." "You've said quite enough over the past months," Jonah said, his tone cold. "This doesn't concern you," Theodore snapped, then seemed to realize the absurdity of that statement, given what had just been revealed. "I mean Eliza, please. I made a mistake. I can see that now." "If I'd known." "If you'd known what?" Eliza asked, finding her voice at last. "If you'd known Jonah was wealthy, you would have treated me differently? That's supposed to make me feel better?" "We could still," Theodore began desperately. "Could still what?" Eliza interrupted. "You're engaged to someone else. You've humiliated me publicly. You destroyed my reputation and my livelihood. And now you want what? Forgiveness? Another chance? Because you've realized you made a bad business decision?" Theodore flinched. "You're angry. I understand. But surely, move away from the wagon," Jonah said. And though his voice remained quiet, something in it made Theodore step back involuntarily. "You had your opportunity with her. You threw it away. She's my wife now, and you'll treat her with the respect you should have shown from the beginning." He clicked to the horses. and the wagon rolled forward, leaving Theodore standing in the dust, his face a mask of impotent rage and devastating regret. They rode in silence for the first mile. Then Eliza spoke, her voice small and lost. "Is it true? All of it?" "Yes," Jonah said. "Every word. I'm sorry you had to learn that way. I'd planned to tell you myself when the time was right." "When would that have been?" Eliza asked. "When we've been married a year? 5 years? Never?" "I don't know," Jonah admitted. "I just know I was afraid. Afraid of exactly what just happened, that everything would change between us." "It has changed," Eliza said. "How could it not? You're not who I thought you were." "I'm exactly who I've always been," Jonah insisted. "The money doesn't change who I am." "It changes everything," Eliza countered. "Our entire marriage is based on assumptions that aren't true. I thought I was marrying a simple man who offered refuge out of kindness. Instead, I married." She gestured helplessly. "I don't even know what to call you. A millionaire pretending to be a hermit? A man who let me believe we were equals when you could buy the entire town?" "We are equals," Jonah said fiercely. "Money doesn't make me better than you." "But it makes us different," Eliza said. "And you lied to me." "I withheld information," Jonah corrected. "That's not the same as lying." "It feels the same," Eliza said quietly. "It feels exactly the same." They rode the rest of the way in heavy silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the cabin, Jonah helped Eliza down from the wagon, but she pulled away from his touch. "I need time," she said, "to think, to process this." "How much time?" Jonah asked. "I don't know," Eliza said honestly. I need to understand what's real and what's been pretense, including my own feelings." She walked into the cabin, leaving Jonah standing alone in the clearing, watching the door close between them like a wall he didn't know how to scale. The ride back to the cabin had been silent, but the silence that followed in the days after was worse. It wasn't angry or hostile, just hollow, the absence of connection that had been carefully building between them. They moved around each other like ghosts, polite and distant, each careful not to intrude on the other's space. Eliza spent hours walking the mountain trails, thinking. The revelation had shattered her understanding of everything. Not just who Jonah was, but what their marriage meant. Had he married her out of genuine care, or had it been some kind of experiment? A wealthy man playing at poverty, testing whether someone could love him without knowing his fortune. The thought made her angry, then sad, then confused. Because the Jonah she'd come to know over the past 3 months, the man who carved chess pieces and read poetry and treated her with unfailing respect, that man felt real. But how much of him had been performance? How much had been calculated to achieve some goal she didn't understand? On the 3rd day after the revelation, Jonah finally broke the silence. She was sitting on the porch watching sunset paint, the mountains gold and crimson when he emerged from the cabin and sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. "I need to tell you everything," he said quietly. "The whole story. Not just the facts, but the reasons behind them. Will you listen?" Eliza considered refusing. Part of her wanted to hold on to her anger, use it as armor against more hurt. But a larger part wanted to understand. Needed to understand if there was anything real worth salvaging. "I'll listen," she said. Jonah took a breath, gathering his thoughts. "I told you about Thomas, about how his death destroyed our family. What I didn't tell you is how it destroyed me. I became," he paused, searching for words, "bitter, suspicious. I saw schemes everywhere, greed in every interaction. I couldn't trust anyone because I couldn't tell real friendship from calculated manipulation." "That's why you left," Eliza said. "Part of it," Jonah agreed. "But there was more. The mining business, it's not clean. To be successful, you make compromises. You deal with corrupt officials, Ignore unsafe conditions if fixing them would reduce profits. Pit communities against each other for favorable contracts. My father did what he had to do to build the company. But after losing Thomas and my mother, I couldn't justify it anymore. Couldn't be part of a system that valued profit over human life. So you ran away, Eliza said, not unkindly. I did, Jonah admitted. I took enough money to buy this land and build this cabin, and I disappeared. Told myself I was making a moral stand, but really, I was just broken. Too broken to face the world that had taken everyone I loved. He fell silent for a moment, and Eliza waited, sensing there was more. I lived here for 5 years, Jonah continued. Alone, mostly content, telling myself I was better off without human connection. Then my father died, and everything came crashing back. The attorneys found me, explained that I was sole heir to everything. I tried to refuse it, but the will was ironclad. The business, the wealth, all of it became mine, whether I wanted it or not. What did you do? Eliza asked. I compromised, Jonah said. I hired a manager I trust to run daily operations. Installed better safety measures, improved wages, stopped the worst of the corrupt practices. I funneled most of the profits into investments that actually help people loans to struggling families. Infrastructure improvements, education funding. I keep enough to live on and maintain the cabin, but the rest goes to causes that matter. That's admirable, Eliza said, and meant it. It's penance, Jonah corrected. For running away, for leaving others to deal with problems I could have helped solve, but I still couldn't face going back to that world. So I managed everything remotely through intermediaries. Kept living here. Kept pretending I was just a mountain man with no responsibilities beyond his trapline. He turned to look at her then, and his eyes held a vulnerability that made her heart ache. Then I saw you at that social, he said. Saw Theodore humiliate you. Saw you stand there with such dignity despite the pain. And I saw something I recognized, someone broken by betrayal, someone who'd lost faith in humanity's goodness. I saw myself 5 years earlier. So you decided to save me? Eliza asked, not quite managing to keep the bitterness from her voice. No, Jonah said firmly. I decided to offer you what no one offered me, a safe place to heal without judgment or expectation. But Eliza, his voice softened. It wasn't entirely selfless. I was lonely, desperately lonely, though I wouldn't admit it. And something about you, your strength, your intelligence, the way you'd survived 8 years of hardship without losing your essential kindness. I was drawn to that. To you. But you didn't tell me the truth, Eliza said. Because I was a coward, Jonah replied simply. I'd watched Thomas die because of wealth-motivated treachery. I'd seen how money corrupted every relationship my family had. I couldn't bear the thought of you seeing me differently once you knew. Couldn't risk watching whatever we were building crumble under the weight of expectations and assumptions. So you let me believe we were equals, Eliza said. Let me feel grateful for basic shelter. When you could have... She stopped, shook her head. You could have given me anything. Everything. Instead, you let me scrub floors and mend worn clothes and feel lucky to have a roof over my head. I never wanted you to feel grateful, Jonah said. I wanted you to feel safe. And I wanted, he stopped, seemed to gather courage. I wanted you to see me, the real me, not the fortune. I wanted to know if what developed between us was genuine or just another version of what Thomas experienced, someone attracted to wealth rather than the person. That's not fair, Eliza said. You never gave me the chance to prove I could see past the money. You're right, Jonah acknowledged. It wasn't fair. I was protecting myself at your expense. I see that now. But Eliza, he reached for her hand, then stopped himself. Everything I felt, everything I said about falling in love with you, that was real. The only real thing in years. Eliza sat with that, feeling emotions war inside her. Anger at the deception, understanding of his fears, confusion about her own feelings. And underneath it all, A truth she'd been avoiding. She'd been falling in love with him too. With the quiet, thoughtful man who carved chess pieces and read poetry and treated her like she mattered. The money didn't change those things, but it changed everything else. "I don't know what to do," she said finally. "I don't know how to trust you again." "I'm not asking you to trust me," Jonah said. "Not yet. I'm asking you to let me prove I'm worthy of trust. Give me time to show you that the man you've been living with, that's who I really am. The wealth is just circumstances, not character." Before Eliza could respond, they heard hoofbeats approaching. Both stood, instantly alert. Visitors were rare this far from town, and after the public revelation, neither was eager for more intrusions. Theodore Blackwell rode into the clearing on a fine horse, looking distinctly uncomfortable. He dismounted, tied the horse to the porch rail, and approached with his hat in his hands, a gesture of supplication that would have been laughable if Eliza weren't so exhausted by everything. "I apologize for intruding," Theodore said, his eyes darting between them. "But I needed to speak with you both, privately, if possible." "We have nothing to say to you," Jonah said coldly. "Please," Theodore said, and there was genuine desperation in his voice. "Just 5 minutes. Then I'll leave and never bother you again." Eliza wanted to refuse, wanted to send him away with the contempt he deserved. But curiosity won out. 5 minutes, she said. Theodore's relief was palpable. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I came to apologize. Properly apologize, not the pathetic display at the celebration. What I did to you, Eliza, there's no excuse for it. I was selfish, calculating, and cruel. I treated you as a convenience rather than a person. And when something better came along, I discarded you without thought for the consequences." "We know what you did," Eliza said. "What's your point?" "My point is that I'm sorry," Theodore said. "Genuinely sorry. Not because I found out your husband is wealthy, though yes, that makes my mistake staggeringly clear, but because I've had time to reflect on my actions. Caroline and I—" He stopped, shook his head. "It's not working. She's exactly what I deserve, actually. Calculating, cold, interested only in status and appearance. We're perfectly matched in our superficiality." "This is fascinating," Jonah said dryly, "but we still don't care." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Theodore said quickly. "I don't deserve it. I'm asking." He looked at Eliza directly. "I'm asking if you're all right. If you're happy. If this marriage," he gestured at Jonah, "if it's what you want. Or if you married him out of desperation, the way I pushed you to." The question hung in the air, and Eliza realized it was the same question she'd been asking herself. Had she married Jonah out of desperation, or had it become something real? "That's none of your business," she said finally. "You're right," Theodore agreed. "But I ruined your life, Eliza. I need to know I didn't ruin it permanently. That you found something genuine after I destroyed everything else." Despite everything, Eliza felt a flicker of sympathy. Theodore was trapped in his own consequences, married to someone as empty as he'd proven himself to be, facing a lifetime of exactly what he'd chosen. The irony was almost painful. "I'm fine," she said. "Better than fine, actually. Not because of money," she glanced at Jonah, "but because I found someone who treats me with respect, who sees me as a person rather than an ornament or a convenience. Whether that becomes lasting love or remains respectful partnership, it's more than I had with you." Theodore nodded slowly, his expression mixing relief and regret. "Good. That's good. He's a fortunate man." He replaced his hat, turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, I hope you'll be happy together. Both of you. You deserve it more than I deserve Caroline." He rode away, leaving them standing together in the clearing. After a moment, Eliza laughed a short, sharp sound that held no humor. "Did that really just happen?" she asked. Apparently, Jonah replied. He looked at her cautiously. What you said to him, did you mean it? Which part? The part about finding someone who treats you with respect, Jonah said. About that being more valuable than what you had before. Eliza considered the question seriously. Despite her anger, despite her confusion, was it true? Yes, she said finally. I meant it. Whatever else has happened between us, you've never treated me as less than your equal. Even with all your wealth, you've never made me feel small or dependent or grateful for crumbs. That matters. It's the only thing that matters to me, Jonah said quietly. That you know your worth, regardless of circumstances or bank accounts or anything else. They stood together watching the last light fade from the sky, not touching, but not as distant as they'd been. Something had shifted, not resolution, exactly, but maybe the beginning of understanding. I need more time, Eliza said finally, to sort through all of this, to understand what I feel versus what I think I should feel. Take all the time you need, Jonah replied. I'm not going anywhere. That night, lying in her small room, Eliza took inventory of her feelings with ruthless honesty. She was angry at Jonah's deception. That was real. She was confused about his motivations, also real. But underneath both, there was something else. Relief. Relief that the man she'd been falling for wasn't a fantasy. Relief that his kindness hadn't been false, just incomplete. Relief that the respect he'd shown her was genuine, not dependent on ignorance of his true station. And there was something more. Something she'd been avoiding acknowledging. She was falling in love with him. Not because of his wealth, she'd been falling before she knew about that, but because of who he was when stripped of everything but character. A man who'd lost everything and chosen kindness anyway. A man who'd been given the world and chose simplicity. A man who treated her as valuable when she felt worthless, thought the money complicated things. But maybe it didn't change them. Maybe the question wasn't whether she could love a wealthy man, but whether she could trust one. And that, she realized, was a question only time and Jonah's actions could answer. I don't want to live in society, Eliza said slowly, thinking through what she really wanted. I've seen what that world does to people, how it corrupts and compromises. But I don't want to hide from it either. There has to be a balance. Tell me what that looks like to you. Jonah said, thought Eliza clasped the locket, drawing strength from its familiar weight. I want to keep the cabin. Keep this life as our foundation. But I want to do more than just manage wealth remotely. I want to be involved in decisions about how it's used. Want to help choose which families receive loans, which communities get support. Want to make a real difference, not just write checks from a distance. You'd be good at that, Jonah said. You understand struggle in ways I never could. You'd know which causes truly matter. We'd decide together, Eliza corrected. Your knowledge of business combined with my understanding of need. Actual partnership, not just one person making choices for both. Jonah smiled a real smile, unguarded and warm. I'd like that. Very much. He paused, then added carefully, there's something else you should know. About what the wealth would mean practically. Tell me, Eliza said. I own property in Clearwater Ridge, Jonah said. Several buildings, actually, including the general store where you worked. Eliza stared at him. You own Adelaide's store? The building, not the business, Jonah clarified. When the previous owner tried to raise her rent 3 years ago, would have forced her out. I bought the property and kept the rent where it was. She doesn't know. As far as she's concerned, she pays the same landlord she always has, through a property management company. You've been protecting her, Eliza said. Protecting the town, Jonah corrected. Adelaide provides a vital service. Losing that store would have hurt the whole community. So I made sure it stayed viable. He paused. There are other properties too. The boarding house, the livery stable, several residential buildings. I've kept rents fair, maintained the buildings properly. use the income to fund other community needs. The church building, Eliza said, remembering. The new school supplies. The Henderson's ranch, you saved it from creditors. I did what I could, Jonah said simply, without making it obvious. People's pride matters. They need to believe they're succeeding through their own efforts, not charity. It's not charity when you're correcting injustice, Eliza said. It's stewardship, using resources to strengthen rather than exploit. That's what I've tried to do, Jonah agreed. But I could do more with help. With someone who understands people, who can see needs I might miss. A partner, Eliza said. An equal partner, Jonah emphasized. Your voice would carry the same weight as mine. Your decisions would matter just as much. Eliza felt something settle in her chest. Not just acceptance, but rightness. This was what she'd been looking for without knowing it. Not rescue, not security bought through dependence, but genuine partnership. The chance to make a real difference using resources they controlled together. I need you to promise me something, she said. No more secrets. If there's anything else I should know, any other surprises waiting. Tell me now. Jonah considered carefully. There's money in San Francisco banks, investments in various enterprises, a house in Denver I've never lived in, but nothing that changes the fundamental truth. I'm a man who'd rather live simply and use wealth to help others than accumulate more just for the sake of having it. That's who I am. That's who I want to be. With me, Eliza said. You want to be that person with me? Yes, Jonah said. If you'll have me, really have me, not the arrangement we started with, but as your actual husband, your partner, he stopped, seemed to search for words. Your choice. Not your necessity, but your choice. Eliza set the locket down carefully on the rock between them. Then she reached up and touched Jonah's face, feeling the roughness of his beard, the warmth of his skin, the reality of him. He went very still, barely breathing, as if afraid any movement might shatter the moment. I choose you, she said clearly. Not because I have to. Not because of money or security or lack of options. I choose you because you're good and kind and honest in ways that matter. Because you see me as valuable when the world said I was ruined. Because you gave me space to heal and then gave me reasons to hope again. Eliza, Jonah breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like prayer. I choose you, she repeated. But I need you to choose me too. Not as a rescue project or a test of character, but as someone you genuinely want to spend your life with. Can you do that? I already have, Jonah said. I chose you the moment I saw you standing in that wreckage with your head held high. I chose you when I offered marriage. I chose you every morning when I woke up grateful you'd stayed. I've been choosing you all along, Eliza. I'll keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life, if you'll let me. She kissed him then, not a tentative exploration, but a declaration. A choice made freely, without coercion or desperation. His arms came around her, gentle but certain, and for the first time since Theodore's betrayal, Eliza felt completely safe. Not because she was protected, but because she was valued. Not because she was dependent, but because she was chosen. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jonah rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said. God help me. I love you so much. I love you too, Eliza replied, and the words felt like liberation. I think I have for weeks. I was just too afraid to admit it. We don't have to be afraid anymore, Jonah said. We can just be honest. Build something real together. Something real, Eliza agreed. A real marriage. A real partnership. A real life. They sat together as the last light faded, holding each other, feeling the rightness of it. The creek sang its eternal song, the mountains stood watch, and two broken people found themselves unexpectedly whole in each other's arms. Later that night, they returned to the cabin hand in hand. At the door to her small room, the room that had been hers alone for 3 months, Eliza paused and looked up at Jonah. "I don't want to sleep alone anymore," she said. "If you're willing." "I've been willing since the day we married," Jonah replied. "I was just waiting for you to be ready." "I'm ready," Eliza said. "For all of it. For you. For us." She led him into the room and closed the door behind them. Outside, the mountains kept their ancient vigil, indifferent to human joy and sorrow. But inside the cabin, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of their separate tragedies discovered that sometimes the worst betrayal really does lead to the greatest blessing. That sometimes the man everyone says isn't good enough turns out to be worth more than all of them combined. Not in money, though that too, but in the currency that truly matters: honor, kindness, and love freely chosen. The cabin had been built as a refuge from the world. Tonight, it became a sanctuary for two hearts learning to trust again, learning to hope again, learning that real love isn't about perfection or pretense. It's about choosing each other honestly, completely, without reservations or secrets. And in that choosing, Eliza and Jonah found what they'd both been searching for without knowing. Not rescue, but partnership. Not security, but freedom. Not the end of heartbreak, but the beginning of joy earned through vulnerability and courage and the willingness to believe against all evidence. That goodness still exists in the world. Sometimes it just wears worn buckskin and lives on a mountain, waiting patiently for the right person to see past, surfaces to the truth beneath. 6 months passed like water flowing over stones, shaping everything it touched into something new and better. The first snow came early that year, dusting the mountains with white and turning the world into something clean and pristine. Eliza stood at the cabin window, watching it fall, her hand resting on the barely perceptible swell of her belly, and felt a contentment she'd never imagined possible. The cabin had grown not in size, but in warmth. Jonah had moved his few possessions down from the loft, and they'd transformed Eliza's small room into a proper bedroom for two. The loft now awaited its future purpose, a nursery, though they hadn't spoken that word aloud yet. Some joys were too precious to rush. They'd found their rhythm as partners in every sense. Twice a month, they traveled to town for business meetings. Eliza had insisted on being present for all decisions about the mining operations and investments. She discovered an aptitude for understanding people's needs, for seeing through false claims to genuine circumstances. Together, they directed funds to expand the school, improve the doctor's office, support 3 widows starting their own businesses. Adelaide's store had received mysterious improvements: new shelving, a better stove, repairs to the roof, all arranged through the property management company. Adelaide suspected, of course. She'd looked at Eliza during their last visit with knowing eyes and said simply, "Your husband's a good man. I'm glad you found each other." The town had adjusted to the revelation of Jonah's wealth with predictable variety. Some treated them with newfound deference that both found uncomfortable. Others, like the Hendersons and Reverend Porter, treated them exactly as they always had, with respect earned through character rather than circumstance. Those were the relationships they valued, the people they invited to the cabin for occasional dinners and honest conversation. Theodore and Caroline had married in a lavish ceremony in San Francisco, according to gossip that reached even the mountains. Eliza felt only distant pity when she heard. Caroline had gotten her wealthy husband, Theodore his advantageous connection. They'd achieved exactly what they'd calculated for, and Eliza suspected they were both miserable in their success. She'd sent Theodore a letter, brief and final. "I forgive you for what you did. Not because you've earned it, but because holding anger serves no purpose. I hope you find whatever you're looking for. I found everything I need." He'd never responded, and she hadn't expected him to. That chapter of her life was closed, its lessons learned and integrated. She'd been broken by his betrayal, but that breaking had led her exactly where she needed to be. This morning, She and Jonah had ridden into town together for a special purpose. Eliza had insisted, despite Jonah's concerns about her traveling in her condition. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," she'd said. "And this matters." They'd met with Adelaide first, presenting her with revised lease terms. The property management company has decided to transfer ownership of the store building to its primary tenant. Jonah had explained, his face carefully neutral. In recognition of 20 years of exemplary stewardship and community service. Adelaide had stared at the deed in her hands, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I can't accept this," she'd whispered. "You already have," Eliza had replied gently. "It's done. The building is yours. You've earned it 100 times over." "This is you too," Adelaide had said, looking between them. "All of it, the repairs, the stable rent, now this." "Why?" "Because you gave me a job when I had nothing," Eliza had said. "Because you taught me that family isn't just blood. Because the town needs you, and we need to make sure you can keep doing what you do best." They'd left Adelaide crying happy tears and moved on to their next appointment, the bank, where they'd arranged funding for a new hospital. Then the land office, where they'd purchased property for a library. Then Reverend Porter's church, where they'd made a donation in Thomas Hale's name for a youth education program that would give other young people the advantages he'd never lived to fully use. Now, back at the cabin as snow fell in earnest, Eliza felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter so faint she almost missed it. She gasped softly, and Jonah looked up from the book he was reading. "What is it?" he asked, immediately alert. "Come here," Eliza said, reaching for his hand. She placed it on her belly, holding it there, waiting. Another flutter, stronger this time. Jonah's expression transformed wonder and joy and something close to reverence. "That's our child," Eliza confirmed. "Our daughter or son. The next chapter of whatever we're building together." "I never thought I'd have this," Jonah said quietly. "A family, real partnership. The chance to be happy instead of just safe." "Neither did I," Eliza replied. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I can't imagine wanting any other life than this one." "No regrets?" Jonah asked. "About the wealth, the complications, everything that comes with who I am." Eliza considered the question seriously. Did she regret knowing the truth? Regret. The adjustment, the occasional intrusion of business, the careful balance they maintained between simple living and responsible stewardship. "No regrets," she said finally. "The wealth is a responsibility, but it's one we carry together, and it lets us do real good. The cabin is still ours. This life is still ours. We just have the means to help others build their own lives too. That's not a burden. That's a gift." Jonah pulled her close, and she felt his heart beating steady and strong against her cheek. "I love you," he said. "More than I thought I could love anyone after losing Thomas and my parents. You brought me back to life, Eliza. Gave me reasons to engage with the world again instead of hiding from it." "We saved each other," Eliza corrected. "You gave me safety when I needed it, and I gave you purpose when you lost yours. That's what partnership means: mutual rescue, mutual strength." They stood together at the window, watching snow transform the world into something beautiful and new. The mountains rose eternal behind them. The cabin held them safe and warm, and between them, new life grew, a symbol of hope and possibility and the future they were building together. A year ago, Eliza had stood in a town square, publicly humiliated, believing her life was over. Now she stood in a mountain cabin, cherished and valued, knowing her life was just beginning. The path from that devastation to this joy had been neither straight nor simple, but every painful step had been necessary. Every betrayal had led to blessing. Every loss had made room for something better. She thought of her father, who believed education was the greatest gift. She thought of her mother, whose cameo she wore daily now, a reminder of grace under pressure. She thought of Theodore, whose cruelty had inadvertently been a mercy, freeing her from a life that would have slowly crushed her spirit. And she thought of Jonah, who'd seen her at her lowest and offered not pity but partnership, who'd hidden his wealth not to deceive but to protect both of them from the corrupting influence he'd seen destroy his family, who'd chosen her when she had nothing because he valued who she was, not what she represented. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Jonah asked. "For seeing me," Eliza replied. "For choosing me. For building this life with me." "I should be thanking you," Jonah said. "You took a chance on a mountain hermit when you had every reason not to trust anyone. You forgave my secrets when you'd been betrayed by lies. You chose to love me despite all the complications." "We're both grateful then," Eliza said. "Both blessed. Both exactly where we're meant to be." Outside, the snow fell heavier, building drifts against the cabin walls, transforming the clearing into a winter wonderland. Inside, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of separate tragedies held each other close, feeling their child move between them, knowing that sometimes the worst betrayal really does lead to the greatest blessing. The town had pitied her for marrying the simple mountain man. Now they envied her, but for the wrong reasons. They saw the wealth and thought that made her fortunate. They didn't understand that the fortune was just circumstance. The real blessing was the man himself, his integrity, his kindness, his unwavering commitment to using privilege responsibly rather than selfishly. She thought she wanted security and status. What she'd needed was partnership and purpose. She thought she'd lost everything when Theodore betrayed her. What she'd actually lost was illusion, making room for truth. And the truth was this: real love isn't about wealth or status or perfect beginnings. It's about choosing each other honestly, supporting each other completely, building something genuine together from whatever materials life provides. Sometimes those materials are broken pieces. Sometimes they're unexpected riches. What matters is what you build and who you build it with, and whether you're brave enough to trust that blessing can emerge from betrayal if you're willing to remain open to hope. Eliza Moreland Holly had remained open, and she'd been rewarded beyond measure. Not with money, though that came too, but with love. Real, earned, chosen love. The kind that weathers revelation and survives secrets. The kind that grows stronger through challenges rather than weaker. The kind worth every painful step it took to find Dot as darkness fell and snow continued its gentle assault on the world outside. Eliza and Jonah prepared dinner together, moving through their evening ritual with the comfort of long practice. They ate by lamplight, played chess. Eliza won, which delighted them both, and retired to their shared bed with the contentment of people who found their place in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were always decisions to make, communities to support, responsibilities to manage. But tonight was for gratitude, for peace, for the simple joy of being together. The cabin on the mountain had been built as a refuge from pain. It had become a sanctuary for joy. And in that transformation lay the whole story. Sometimes what seems like an ending is actually a beginning. Sometimes the man everyone says isn't good enough is exactly who you need. And sometimes, against all odds and expectations, heartbreak leads to the greatest love story you never knew you were meant to live.